The ferry from the mainland came in twice a week, and everyone on the island knew its schedule better than their own heartbeats. She had arrived on the Tuesday crossing in late September, when the water was the color of pewter and the wind off the strait cut through whatever you were wearing, regardless of how many layers you'd thought to put on. The dock at Kettle Cove was 3 planks wide at the gangway, and the boards were slick with spray. She stepped onto them carefully, not because she was afraid of falling, but because she had learned that careful was how you arrived somewhere new when you were carrying everything you had left in one bag and the last of your intention in your chest. The village behind the dock was the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to explain itself. A hardware store, a post office that was also a pharmacy. A cafe with a handwritten sign in the window that said open on one side and closed on the other and gave no indication which applied. Cannery at the far end of the waterfront, no longer canning anything, its tin roof gone the color of old blood. 2 fishing boats at the float, one active and one that had been promising to sink for years and kept not doing it. She stood on the dock with her bag and looked at all of it. A man on the hardware store steps was watching her the way island people watch newcomers. Completely, and as though they weren't. He went back inside. She picked up her bag and walked toward the post office. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 60 and had the particular efficiency of someone who had been the only post office for long enough that she had also become the only information desk, the only immigration office, and the only first impression the town had to offer. She did not look up when the door opened. When she did, her expression was neutral in the way of someone who had learned that most strangers either needed directions to the campsite or were lost looking for a different island entirely. She said she was looking for work. She said she had heard there was a man who ran a boat repair operation out of the cannery building, that he was looking for someone with mechanical experience. The woman at the counter looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the bag. "That'll be Oscar Vane," she said. "He's out at the point this time of day, working on the Henniker boat." She paused. "You could wait. He comes in around 4. She said she would wait. She set her bag beside the door where it would not be in the way and stood at the window that looked out over the water. The woman at the counter went back to sorting envelopes. Outside, the cafe sign had been turned to open. A dog lay on the bottom step of the hardware store as though it had been placed there decoratively. The light off the water was low and white. She had come a long way. The letter in her jacket pocket was 6 weeks old, written by a woman named Scobie, who ran the fishing lodge 2 islands north and had mentioned, in passing, that she knew a man who needed a hand who knew engines and was not afraid of salt water. She had written back the same day. The reply had taken 3 weeks and said only, "Come if you want the work. We can talk terms when you get here." She had taken that as enough. She stood at the window and watched a gull land on a piling and immediately regret it. The water moved in its gray way. A truck came down the main road, slowed at the dock, and kept going. She did not sit. There was a chair near the door, but she did not use it. Sitting felt like a concession to uncertainty she wasn't ready to make. At 4:10, a skiff came around the point with 1 man in it. She saw it from the window and watched him bring it into the dock float without hurrying, without any unnecessary motion. He secured the line with 2 half hitches and stepped up onto the dock and stood a moment, looking at the village, the way a man looks at a place when he is checking that it is the same as when he left it. Then he walked up toward the post office. He came in without knocking, which was his right, and nodded at the woman at the counter who said, "She's been waiting," without looking up from her envelopes. He turned. He was perhaps 45, or perhaps 50 with a good constitution, salt-weathered the way people get who spend most of their time outside and don't spend much time thinking about it. There was grease on his forearms that the wash-up on the boat hadn't entirely taken. He looked at her in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who needed the measure of a thing and intended to get it. "You're the one about the engine work," he said. "Yes," she said. He said, "Where did you train?" She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man processing information rather than agreeing to anything. "The Henniker boat's a 1974 Volvo Penta," he said. "Inboard. She's been running rough for 2 months and I haven't had time to get to the bottom of it." She said, "What have you ruled out?" He looked at her then in a slightly different way. Not surprised exactly, more like something had been confirmed. Fuel system's clean, he said. I changed the impeller in the spring. Could be the heat exchanger, she said. It could be the heat exchanger. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile exactly, more the precursor to one that he'd decided wasn't necessary yet. He picked up her bag before she had the chance to argue about it and held the door. Outside, the afternoon had gone soft at the edges. The mountains on the mainland were turning blue across the strait. He set her bag in the back of a truck that was maybe 12 years old and had lived every one of them. She climbed up to the passenger side without waiting to be helped. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot, and they drove without speaking. After a moment, he said, "The cannery building has a back room. Cot, electric heater, basin. Nothing fancy," she said. "All right," he said. "There's a kitchen in the main space. I don't use it much." She said, "I cook." He glanced at her once, briefly, the way a person checks a gauge. Then he looked back at the road. The cannery building was at the end of the waterfront road, set back from the dock float by 100 feet of gravel. It was large and low, and smelled like every cannery building she had ever been near, which was salt and rust and the ghost of fish oil, and something underneath that might have been cedar, but was probably just age. The roll-up door on the waterside was down. He went around to the side door and let them in. Inside, 3 boats were in various states of repair on stands. An aluminum signer with its hull opened up along the keel, a fiberglass runabout with no motor, and the Henniker boat, a 32-foot wooden cruiser with the engine hatch open and a drop light hanging into it on a cord. The tools were laid out on a bench along the wall, with the particular organization of a man who put things back where they came from and expected them to be there next time. She noticed that immediately. He set her bag near the interior door that led to the back room. She opened it and looked in. Cot, heater, basin, a window that faced the water, a hook on the wall, a shelf with nothing on it. The room had the coolness of a space that had been empty long enough to develop its own climate. She set her bag on the cot and came back out. "I can look at the Henniker tonight," she said, "if the light's adequate." He considered this. "Morning's better," he said. "The light's better," she said. "All right," he said. "There's soup on the stove in the kitchen if you want it." He paused, and in the pause she understood that this was not an offer of company, only of food, and that the distinction mattered to him as much as it mattered to her. "Help yourself," he said. Then he went to the signer and picked up where he'd left off. She found the kitchen. She found the soup, which was a fish chowder and had been made by someone who knew how to make fish chowder. She found a bowl and a spoon and ate standing at the counter, with the window open a crack and the sound of the water coming in and the sound of him working coming through the wall. The sounds were compatible. She noted that. She woke before it was light. The heater had held through the night and the room was warm enough. She lay on the cot for a moment and listened. The tide was up. She could tell by the way the water sound was closer and lower. No wind. The building settling in its own way, small sounds she would learn in time to ignore. She got up and dressed and went out to the main floor. He was not there yet. The drop light still hung in the Henniker's engine hatch. She turned on the overhead and found a headlamp on the tool bench and climbed down into the engine space. The Volvo Penta was a 270 horsepower diesel, old enough to have outlived the warranty by 20 years and reliable enough to have made that irrelevant. She worked through it methodically, the way she had been taught, starting at the intake and following the system downstream. The heat exchanger showed scale buildup on the inlet. Not the only problem, she kept going. By the time she found the cracked impeller housing, the one he hadn't found because it was hidden behind the raw water pump and required removing the pump to see properly, the light had changed at the high windows and she could hear him come in the side door. He did not call out. She heard the coffee being made. Then she heard his boots on the floor. He stopped at the engine hatch and looked down. She was holding the cracked housing in one hand and the flashlight in the other. She said, "The heat exchanger needs to be replaced, but this is also part of your problem." He crouched at the hatch edge and took the housing from her and turned it in his hands. She watched him find the crack with his thumb. He was quiet for a moment. "I looked at that pump in June," he said. "The crack's hairline," she said. "You have to take the pump off to see the back of the housing." He looked at it another moment. Then he said, "I'll call Tofino for the parts." She said, "The heat exchanger, ask them to check if they have the 2B series. The 3A is the listed replacement, but the 2B fits better in the bay." He looked at her, not sharply, with the same kind of attention he'd given the cracked housing. "How do you know that?" he said. "I did this repair on a Penta 270 in Comox," she said, 3 years ago. He nodded once slowly and stood and went to make the call. She climbed out of the engine hatch and wiped her hands on the rag she'd tucked in her back pocket and went to get coffee. The parts took 4 days. In the meantime, she turned her attention to the aluminum Ziner. He had not asked her to. She had looked at it the first night and seen the problem in the keel weld, the place where the metal had been worked too many times in the same spot and gone thin. She had learned to read that kind of fatigue without being able to say when exactly she'd learned it. You simply looked at things long enough and they started to tell you what was wrong with them. She brought it up at breakfast on the second morning. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee and a sheaf of papers that were part invoice and part tide chart. She said, "The Ziner has a stress fracture in the keel weld, port side, about 18 inches forward of the bilge pump housing." He set down his coffee. He did not say, "How do you know?" "How bad," she said. "You can get another season out of it if the weld's reinforced before she goes back in. Maybe 2 seasons. After that, you're gambling." He was quiet. Then he said, "Quinlan's been running her hard." She didn't know who Quinlan was. She said, "It shows." Something in his face settled in a way she couldn't quite name. Not amusement, something more like recognition. He looked back at his papers, and she poured a second cup of coffee and went back to work. She reinforced the weld herself over the following 2 days, working in segments the way the material required, letting it cool between passes. He came by twice and looked without commenting. On the second pass, he handed her a piece of clean rag for the grinder guard without her having to ask and went back to his own work. She noticed the timing of it. He had been watching long enough to know when she would need it. A boy of about 12 came by on the third afternoon. He let himself in through the side door and headed directly for the coffee, as though this was established practice. He stopped short when he saw her. "Didn't know anyone was here," he said. She said, "There is." He looked at the Ziner, at the weld work, at her, in the assessing order of a child who is deciding whether an adult is worth talking to. "Are you the one fixing the Henniker?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Dad says it's been making a sound like a tin can full of gravel." "It has been," she said. "It won't anymore." He considered this and seemed to find it acceptable. He poured his coffee, which she noticed he drank black and without ceremony, and sat on a crate near the wall and watched her work. He asked questions, not constantly, but at intervals, and the questions were the questions of someone who was actually paying attention rather than filling time. She answered them without adjustment the same way she would have answered an adult. He stayed for almost an hour and left when something outside called him that she couldn't hear. She thought about the questions long after he'd gone. The way he'd asked about the weld progression, the particular patience in it for a boy his age. That evening she walked down to the dock float. The tide was low, and the smell of seaweed and salt and old rope came up off the rocks in a way that was unpleasant, and then, after a moment, not. The mainland mountains were lit at the top by the last of the sun, dark below. A seiner was coming in around the point, running lights on its diesel, a low, steady sound across the water. She stood at the end of the float and watched it come in. She was aware of being a long way from where she had been. Not physically. She had been farther, only in the sense that the distance between where she'd been and where she was standing now was not measurable in miles. She had left the island she'd grown up on 3 years ago, in the particular way you leave a place when staying has become the same as disappearing. She did not think about it much. It was only that being on an island again made certain things present that she had learned to keep in the background. The seiner came alongside the float, and she walked back up to the cannery. He was at the workbench when she came in, doing an inventory of something, making marks in a small notebook with a stub of pencil. He did not look up. She went to the kitchen and made supper because it was her turn, which was not something they had discussed, but something that had simply become true in the way of things that make sense. She made what there was to make, which was pasta and canned tomatoes, and a tin of sardines she found at the back of the cupboard. She called through the wall when it was ready. He came in and washed his hands and sat down and ate without ceremony. She sat across from him. He ate the way she had come to expect, present and quiet, without performance. After a while, he said, "The boy asked about you." She said, "He came by this afternoon." "I know," he said. "He asks about engines, asks about everything, but especially engines." A pause. His mother was the same way. She did not ask about his mother. The past tense had been quiet but clear. She let it settle. He pushed back from the table and stood. He said, "Parts will be in Thursday." He carried his plate to the basin. His plate, his work. That had also become the arrangement without being discussed. She sat with her cup for a while after he'd gone back to the bench. The pasta was adequate. The sardines had been the right call. She thought about what he'd said about the boy, the way he'd said it. The careful accounting of a man who chose what he offered and did not offer more than he meant. The parts came in on a Thursday as promised. She picked them up from the ferry with the truck, which he'd left her the keys for without comment. The ferryman helped her with the heat exchanger because it was heavy. He asked whose she was, and she said she was working for Oscar Vane out of the cannery, and he said, "Oh, right," and that was the end of it. She had the Henniker's heat exchanger, pulled by noon, and the new one seated by mid-afternoon. He came by with water at some point and set it on the gunwale without interrupting her. When she came up for air, it was there. The impeller housing went in clean. She ran the engine on the float with the water pickup rigged and listened to it for a long time with her hand on the valve cover, feeling through the vibration for anything wrong. There was nothing wrong. She shut it down and climbed out and stood in the late afternoon light with her hands on her hips and listened to the quiet it left behind. He was at the far end of the float, doing something with a length of line. He didn't come over. After a moment, he said, without turning around, "How does she sound?" She said, "Like she should have sounded in June." He nodded, still not turning around. He finished what he was doing with the line and walked back past her and up to the building, and she understood from the set of his shoulders that this was as close to approval as the work was going to get. And she was fine with that. She had worked for people who expressed every opinion they had, and she had found it exhausting. This was not exhausting. That evening after supper, she was at the kitchen table with a wiring diagram for the runabout's ignition system. The overhead light was not quite enough, so she had moved the lamp from the shelf near the door to the table. He came in for more coffee and stopped when he saw the lamp. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "There's a better lamp in the storeroom. More spread," she said. "This one's fine for now." He went to the storeroom and came back that was indeed better, a wide-shade work lamp, and set it on the table without asking. Then he went back to whatever he'd been doing. She turned it on. The diagram came clear across the whole page. She sat and traced the wiring and thought about the lamp, the precision of it. He had seen what she needed before she'd finished thinking she needed it. She filed that away, not for any particular reason, only in the way she filed everything about a new place. Learning what was fixed and what moved. 3 weeks in, a woman came by the cannery. Her name was Wren McAllister, and she ran the fishing lodge on the north end of the island, and she said she'd heard there was someone new at Vane's place who knew engines, and she needed a second opinion on a stern drive unit that had been giving her grief. She addressed the question to Oscar. He nodded in her direction and said, "She's the one to ask." The woman turned to her with the bright recalibrating look of someone who had not expected that answer. She took it without comment. She said, "Tell me what it's doing." They talked for 20 minutes. She told the woman what she thought the problem was, and told her what it would take to confirm it, and what it would take to fix it if she was right. The woman listened the way a person listens when they are deciding whether to trust the information. And at the end she said, "Can you come out Friday?" She said, "I'll need to check with Oscar." She said it naturally, without thinking about it. She heard herself say it, and noticed the way it landed in the room. Wren McAllister noticed it too, she could tell, though neither of them said anything about it. She looked over at him. He was at the signer and did not look up. He said, "Friday's fine." After the woman left, she went back to the runabout ignition. He worked without comment for a while. Then he said, "She's been running that lodge for 11 years. Her husband built it." She said, "What happened to the husband?" he said. He moved to Prince George. A pause. The lodge didn't. She looked at the wiring diagram. Above the kitchen window, there was a water stain on the ceiling, old and pale, shaped like a river delta branching south. She had been looking at it for 3 weeks and not asking about it. She looked at it now and then looked back at the diagram. The runabout ignition turned out to be a corroded ground connection, which was both the most common problem and the most often overlooked because it was the most common problem. She fixed it in 40 minutes. She was cleaning the terminal when the boy came in after school. He watched her for a moment and then said, "What was wrong with it?" She told him. He thought about this. He said, "So it was completing the circuit but not well enough." "Exactly," she said. He said, "Like a door that's almost latched." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." He seemed pleased with this and went to pour his coffee. She went back to the terminal. Outside, the light was doing what light did at this time of year in this latitude, going gold and low in the early afternoon, making everything look more resolved than it was. She thought about the door. That's almost latched. The way he'd reached for an analogy rather than just absorbing the fact. That was a particular way of thinking. She had known one other person who thought that way, and she did not let herself follow that thread for long. On the Friday, she went out to Ren McAllister's lodge. The stern drive unit was a Mercruiser on a 26-foot fiberglass cruiser that had been improperly winterized 2 years running and was paying for it now. She confirmed what she'd suspected and gave Ren McAllister a list of parts and a timeline. Ren McAllister wrote it all down and then said, over coffee at the kitchen table of the lodge, "How long are you staying?" She said, "I'm not sure." Ren McAllister looked at her in the direct way of a woman who has run a lodge for 11 years and does not waste time being indirect. She said, "Oscar hasn't had anyone working with him since the Devereaux boy left for school." That was 4 years ago. She said she didn't know that. Ren McAllister said, "He's a careful man. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She didn't answer. She drank her coffee. The lodge windows looked out over a different stretch of water than the cannery did, and the light was different, coming from the east rather than the west, and something about the difference made her aware of how specifically she had already learned the other light. The one that came into the cannery in the mornings, the angle of it, the color at different times of day. She drove back to the cannery in the late afternoon. He was on the dock when she came down, making adjustments to one of the float lines. The tide had come up and the floats were riding differently, and he was rebalancing. She watched him from the top of the ramp for a moment, without him knowing she was there. The way he worked, the same quality she'd noticed from the first day. Nothing wasted, no motion that hadn't been decided first. She went down the ramp and he heard her and glanced up. "Merits a full repower," she said. "But she can get through one more season if Ren's careful about the temperature." He nodded. He went back to the line. She said, "The boy, what's his name?" He looked up again. He said, "Callum." Then he paused, as though he'd said something that required acknowledgement. "My sister's boy. She lives in Campbell River. He spends term time with me." She said, "He thinks in analogies." He considered this. "He does," he said. He went back to the line. She went back up the ramp. She stood at the top for a moment and looked at the water and the mountains across it and the sky going amber at the top of the peaks. She thought about Ren McAllister. She thought about the word careful and what it meant when someone used it about a person rather than an action. She was not in the habit of examining her own thinking about things, and she did not start now. She just stood there and let the sky do what it was doing and then went inside. November came in with rain that was not dramatic, only persistent. The kind of rain that became the condition of the air rather than weather that was happening to it. She learned the cannery building in the rain, which gaps let it in, which windows to crack and which to leave. The oil heater in the back room had a particular sequence you had to use to light it reliably, and she learned that. She learned which boards on the dock ramp were slick before the others. She learned the sound of the float at high tide and low, and the sound of the building when the wind was from the south versus the north, and the way the overhead light in the main floor flickered once when the heat came on and then held. She learned the rhythm of his days. In by 7:30, coffee first, then the float check, then the work. Lunch at noon or not at all, depending on what the work was doing. Done by dark or later, depending on the same. He did not explain his schedule, and she did not ask about it. She simply became acquainted with it, the way you become acquainted with the weather in a place. By paying attention over time. One morning in the second week of November, she came into the main floor and found him standing at the Henniker, which was out of the water now on stands, running his hand along the hull planks, not checking for anything specific, just running his hand along them. She got her coffee and stood at a distance and watched. After a moment, he said, without looking up, "She's a 1961 build." She said, "I know." I looked at the builder's plate. He said, 63 years old, and the planks are tight as the day she was built. He paused. Whoever owned her before Henniker took care of her. She said, "You can tell." He looked up then. He said, "There's a plank on the port quarter that wants recalking. I can get to it in a week or two." She said, "I can do it." He looked at her for a moment. "I know caulking," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, closer to the thing that happens when you have been carrying an expectation carefully and it turns out the expectation was correct. "All right," he said. He went back to looking at the planks. She went to start on the runabout, which still needed its fuel system bled. But she stayed at a slight distance from where she was going for a moment and looked at the Henniker and thought about 63 years and tight planks and whoever had come before. She thought about care as a thing you could see the evidence of in a hull. She thought about that for a little while, and then she went to bleed the fuel system. She did the caulking on a Thursday when the temperature was above 6 and the material would seat properly. He showed her the method he used, not because she'd asked, but because it was his boat and he had a way he wanted it done. She watched his hands. He rolled the compound in the way that told her he'd done it enough times to have stopped thinking about the technique and started thinking about the result. She tried it on the first length and he did not say anything. She tried the second length and he came and crouched beside her and looked at the joint and said, "Even pressure the whole way through. You're easing off at the end." She tried the third length with even pressure the whole way through. She could feel where the error had been. A small impatience at the finish of the stroke, a letting go just before the work was done. He looked at the third length. He said, "There it is." He stood and went back to the signer. She kept going. By mid-afternoon, she had caulked the port quarter and was cleaning the compound off her hands with mineral spirits when the boy came in, trailing an older girl she hadn't seen before, who had the look of a person who had been brought somewhere against her judgment. The girl's name was apparently Sable, from the way the boy said it, which was loudly and as though it was proof of something. The girl looked at the boats and said it smelled like fish. The boy said it smelled like engine oil. He seemed to consider this a correction. She watched them from across the floor. The girl noticed her and startled slightly in the way of people who don't expect to see a woman working in a place like this. She said hello to the girl. The girl said hello back and then wandered toward the door in the way of someone who has decided the visit has lasted long enough. The boy stayed. He asked about the caulking. She told him. He asked why the compound had to be above a certain temperature to seat properly. She told him that too, and she watched him file it away in the particular internal manner he had, not writing it down, not repeating it back, just receiving it and placing it somewhere. He said, "When we did the fiberglass repair on the runabout, why didn't the same rule apply?" She said, "Because fiberglass resin cures through a chemical reaction that generates its own heat. Caulking compound is different. It needs ambient warmth to stay pliable long enough to seat." He thought about this. "So the fiberglass is making its own conditions," he said. "And the caulking needs the conditions to already be there." She stopped cleaning the compound off her hands and looked at him. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He nodded and went to see what his uncle was doing. She watched him cross the floor. She thought about what it would be like to be 12 and think the way he thought. She thought about what it would be like to be around someone who thought that way for a long time. She did not follow that thought to its end. She went back to cleaning her hands. December came with shorter days. By 3 in the afternoon, the light at the high windows was already going, and they often worked by the overhead and the drop lights, which gave the floor a particular quality, warm and contained, the kind of light that makes a space feel like something decided rather than something accidental. She had started to think of the cannery that way, as something decided, though she had not decided it consciously and could not have told you when it had happened. One evening she was in the kitchen after supper, working on an order list for parts. He came in and sat across from her with his own papers. The lamp was between them. Outside, the rain had come up and was hitting the metal roof in a way that had a rhythm you could almost call music if you were being generous. She was not usually generous with music. She found herself thinking it anyway. After a while he said, "Quinlan wants the signer back in the water first week of January." She said, "The weld will hold for it." He said, "I know." She said, "To come out again next fall." "The starboard side needs looking at too," he said. "I know that too." He was quiet. "Quinlan doesn't know it yet," she said. "That's your conversation," he said. "It is." He looked at his papers. "It usually goes better with evidence," she said. "I can write up what I found. The progression of the fatigue, the measurement at the weld, where you'd expect to see the same thing on the starboard side, given the running pattern." He looked up. He held her gaze for a moment. She did not look away, he didn't either. Then he looked back at his papers. "I'd appreciate that," he said. She went back to the order list. The rain kept on. The lamp was between them and adequate for both purposes, and neither of them said anything about it. January came in cold and clear, the mountains across the straight white all the way down. The Henniker went back in the water on a Wednesday. She was there when they launched her, standing on the float as the travel lift brought her down. When the hull touched, she watched the waterline settle, watched for any sign of weeping at the seam they'd recaulked. The hull was dry. The engine turned over on the second try and ran without a sound that didn't belong to it. Quinlan was an older man, barrel-chested and specific in his opinions, and he stood on the float and listened to his engine and looked like a man who had been given back something he had stopped expecting to get back. He shook Oscar's hand. He looked at her and said, "You the one that found the housing?" She said she was. He said, "She hasn't run like this since Corrigan had her." She said she didn't know who Corrigan was. He told her at some length who Corrigan was. She listened. She understood that the telling was the thank you, that you didn't get a shorter version of it. When Quinlan finally went up to the boat to take her out for a run, she stood on the float and listened to the engine sound change as it moved away across the water, diminishing with distance, but holding its quality. Even and even and even, all the way out. He stood beside her for a moment. He said, "You'll want to see the Alderman boat when it comes in next week." She said, "What's wrong with it?" He said, "I'm not sure yet. That's why I thought you'd want to see it." She looked at the water, at the Henniker getting smaller across the strait, its wake spreading and flattening and going still. She thought about being not sure and being curious rather than worried about it. She thought about that as a quality. She said, "All right." He nodded and went back up the ramp. She stayed on the float another minute. The water was very flat, and the mountains across it were very clear, and the sky was the particular winter blue that only shows up when the cold is thorough all the way through the air. A merganser went past low on the water, intent on something she couldn't see. She thought about the Alderman boat. She thought about next week. She thought, briefly and practically, and without drama, about the week after that. Then she turned and walked back up the ramp. And when she reached the top, the cannery building was in front of her, and the door was open, and the light inside was on, and she went in.